I have the great pleasure of hosting Dr. Rick Doblin. So, Dr. Doblin, thanks so much for your time and for doing this podcast.
It's my pleasure. I really think we're at the stage where public education is the most important thing that we need to be doing.
So, my first question would be what inspired you to dedicate your life to psychedelic research and therapy?
Well, I'm 71 years old now. I focused my life on psychedelics when I was 18, so 53 years ago. What really was the motivating force was, I guess I would say, fear of the world. I grew up, born in 53, grew up on stories of the Holocaust, I'm Jewish, have distant relatives killed. And just this, the horror of what people can do to each other was just really prevalent. Um, my dad was a doctor, family was well off. Um, I was also a young boy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so now it was like, oh my God, I'm hearing about the Holocaust. Now I'm hearing about the whole world could blow up. And it just made me realize that there was the problems that we were facing. E.O. Wilson has said this quote that you may have heard of, which is phenomenal. He said, the real problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions with godlike technologies. So it came clearer to me as I was growing up that the enemy was outside. Now the enemy was the Russians, it was the Germans, now it's the Russians, then it was Vietnam. Then I'm like, oh my God, my own country is doing stuff that I think is destructive and not helpful. And I'm just, how do I respond? How do I respond? And I studied nonviolent political resistance, Gandhi and Thoreau, and all of this, and decided that I would be a draft resistor, that I would not register for the draft, and that I would go to jail, and that would drain money from the system, and that would be my protest. So I'm thinking about that, and my parents were like, well, that's okay. We're supportive of what you're trying to do, but you're never going to be able to be a doctor or a lawyer or anything that requires a license because you're going to be a convicted felon for not registering for the draft. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to have to pay that price. That'll be the pay of the price. But still, I don't know, what am I going to do? How am I going to respond to this crazy, murderous world? Beautiful world, also, of course. But how do I respond to this? And I grew up believing that psychedelics were terrible. I had learned that psychedelics hurt your chromosomes and you're going to have deformed babies. I was told that if you take LSD 5 or 6 times, you're now certifiably insane. That's all it takes. And I believed all this. And I didn't know what my parents didn't drink, they didn't smoke, they were very rational. I didn't know what. So, what really opened the door is I was learning about the other. I was very interested in learning about the other. And and that at the time was Russia. So I studied Russian in high school. And in the summer of after my junior year, my parents sent me to Russia. And with around 65 other high school students from around America, and we studied Russian in 1970. And it was just incredible to confront these Russians and to realize that they didn't really want to kill me, that they didn't hate me, that their governments were doing this, but they didn't actually want to kill me. And that was a shocker to me. All right, but then I come back, and my senior year of high school, a friend of mine in the Russian class gives me a book to read, and I loved it. I read this book, and I gave it back to him, and he said, "Do you realize that the author of this wrote some of this book while he was under the influence of LSD?" And I'm like, impossible. Nothing good comes from LSD. It's a hallucination. It's a delusion. You're going crazy. You can't do anything good. He said, no, no, it's true. Check it out. As it turned out, he was right. This book was by Ken Kesey. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was about this, yeah, it was about the individual and the society. And once I realized that Ken had done LSD and had written some of this under LSD, I was like, what have I been told? Have I been told this whole story that's not true? So that led me to think, okay, I'm going to try starting to use psychedelics.
And can you share the crucial moments that led you to founding a multidisciplinary association for psychedelic studies?
Yeah, yeah. But let me just go back so that I tried psychedelics my first year in college, and it was overwhelming. I was not emotionally mature. I was not spiritually mature. One of the biggest disappointments of my life at that point had been my bar mitzvah. I thought that my bar mitzvah was going to be a spiritual experience, turn me into a man, something would happen, and nothing happened. Like these rites of passage that we have that may have worked great in the past, they didn't work for me. So when I try LSD for the first time in college, I'm like, who am I? Where do I fit in? It took a lot of courage to let go. And I thought, aha, this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. But then I had the wrong idea. I had this idea that many people do have, that the more drugs you take, the faster you evolve. I didn't understand really the need for integration, the need for pondering at length what happens. It's not just about going out, it's about what you bring back. And I didn't really understand that. So I did more and more LSD and got more and more confused. And I went to the guidance counselor at my college and I said, I would really like some help. These psychedelic experiences are becoming more important to me than my school. And at the same time, I'm seeing the backlash now where Timothy Leary is the most dangerous man in America, and according to Nixon, and research is being wiped out. And my guidance counselor said, it is important what you're doing. And here's a book to read. And this book was Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research by Stan Grof. And that book was, I was so lucky because that book hadn't even been published yet. It wasn't published till 1975, but in 1972, my guidance counselor gave me a manuscript copy of it directly from Stan. And it was reading Stan's book that made me decide to devote my life to psychedelics. And part of the reason was, first off, that it was science. I had a lot of concerns about what you hear from religions. I trusted science, but it was science focused on healing. It was like the reality test of therapy, but it was also science looking at realms of the human unconscious, meaning biographical situations, confrontation with birth trauma, but also transpersonal spiritual things. And it was sort of a scientific lens looking at these unitive mystical experiences. And so that was it, this idea that if we understand how we're all connected and we're all interconnected, and that's what we learned from quantum mechanics, that uncertain.
Quantum entanglement and superposition and everything else. Yeah.
Yeah, we're all interconnected. We're all individuals and connected, like wave and particle at the same time, in a way. We're all interconnected. And I thought if people feel that, not just hear it, but if you feel it and experience it, that's going to be an antidote to fundamentalism, to killing other people, because we're all essentially the same. We're all connected. And I thought, okay, this has political implications. Why is Nixon thinking that Leary's the most dangerous man in America? Because he's not like, go Vietnam, we're the best, kill all these people. He's more like, and that was where psychedelics were adopted all by the hippies and on all this and the anti-war movement. So I thought, okay, I've got this opportunity. Luckily, my parents are willing to support me. So I was like, okay, I can become an underground psychedelic therapist. I'm going to get this conviction for being a draft resistor, but you don't need a license to be an underground psychedelic therapist. I was already identifying as a counterculture drug-using criminal. That's who I was, a counterculture drug-using criminal. And the arc of my life has been to become from counterculture to culture, from criminal to legal, but to still continue using psychedelics and marijuana and other things like that to explore. So that was really what solidified it. Now, what led to the maps was that I realized at this time that I was way out of balance, that I was overdeveloped intellectually and underdeveloped emotionally and spiritually. Albert Einstein has said this great quote. He said, the splitting of the atom has changed everything, and hence we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. What shall be required if mankind is to survive is a whole new mode of thinking. So what is this whole new mode of thinking? At the same time that I was doing this, explorations with LSD, people were going to the moon. America was sending people to the moon. Edgar Mitchell comes back and saying that seeing the Earth from space and understanding our role in the universe changed everything for him. So I started understanding the political implications of this unitive mystical experience. They called it the overlook effect from the point of view of the astronauts. And so I ended up realizing, though, that I was so out of balance that I couldn't, and the backlash had happened. And Nixon was running the war in Vietnam, and psychedelics were squashed, everything was criminalized. I said, okay, I need to do personal development. I'm out of balance. I need to improve my own instrument in a sense. So that took me 10 years basically of building houses, building things in the physical world, getting grounded. And then in 1982, I was ready to go back to school as a college freshman to learn how to be a psychedelic therapist. And so in 1982, I went back to New College in Sarasota, Florida, the same college I dropped out of, and they permit off campus study. And I went to Esalen for my very first in Big Sur, California, for a month-long workshop with Stan Groff called The Mystical Quest. And my goal was to develop a curriculum to become a psychedelic therapist for me to follow the next 4 years in college. While I was there, I learned about MDMA. And what I learned was that MDMA was, under the code name Adam, was a really reliable tool to facilitate psychotherapy in an unusual way. It wasn't the same as LSD or psilocybin or mescaline or anything like that. It wasn't like a classic psychedelic. It didn't dissolve your ego. It wasn't in that way, but it was opening your heart, reduction of fear. But I learned that it was also being used as a party drug under the name ecstasy. So so what I realized is I learned about LSD after the backlash. But now I'm learning about MDMA before the backlash. There will be a backlash because even though it's a quiet therapy drug that around 500,000 people had used, or 500,000 doses had been distributed in therapeutic settings, quiet personal homes, people didn't know about it, but they knew about ecstasy as a party drug. And this was during Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan and, just say no and escalation of the drug war. So I thought, okay, now I'm older, I'm a little bit more mature, and I can now get politically involved to protect MDMA before the backlash. Because while it's still legal, we can introduce it to people. And one of the main people we introduced it to, myself and others that were working on this, was Lester Grinspoon. And Lester Grinspoon was a professor at Harvard Medical School. He was one of the leading psychiatrists in America. He edited the annual review by the American Psychiatric Association of the latest research. He had the Harvard Mental Health Letter. He had been a strong advocate for drug policy reform. And so Lester was one of the people, and others we worked with Roman Catholic monks, Brother David Steindl-Rast, the rabbis, Zalman Schachter, all sorts of people that would experiment when it was legal and would be prepared to testify in a hearing when it came time. So 1984, the DEA moves to criminalize ecstasy. They had no knowledge of the therapeutic use. In fact, in an article in Newsweek, which was the first major article about MDMA in the popular media, Frank Sapienza, who was a DEA agent running the effort to try to criminalize MDMA, said we took them completely by surprise. So I started a nonprofit in '84 to gather support to do this. DEA moved against MDMA in the summer of '84. We had these hearings, and we won. We won in the court of public opinion. We won in the courts. The judge said MDMA should be Schedule 3, meaning it should be available as a medicine. Illegal as a party drug, but legal as a medicine. And the administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration rejected the recommendation, kept it illegal. This was clearly happening. So the legal effort to protect therapeutic use of psychedelics did not work. And so what I realized is that in 1986, that I need to start MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, as a nonprofit psychedelic pharma company. The only avenue I thought to bring it back was through science, through medicine, through the FDA. And that's what led to the start of MAPS.
What are MAP's current top priorities in advancing the psychedelic-assisted therapy?
Well, 1986, I started MAPS. I had the understanding, which I now realize was wrong, but I had the understanding that MDMA was in the public domain. MDMA was invented by Merck in 1912, and it was off patent. So MDMA was in the public domain. When I learned about MDMA, it was already had been used as a therapy drug for a wide range of different things. So there were no um, real patents on uses of MDMA. So I just thought, okay, MDMA is going to be in the public domain. Um, it took me basically till 2014, 28 years after I started MAPS, to realize that I had missed. This is after I got my PhD at the Kennedy School in 2001, focusing on FDA regulation of psychedelics and marijuana, that I had missed something fundamental, which was that there was this provision signed into law in 1984 by Ronald Reagan, of all things, to provide incentives for developing drugs that are off patent. And those incentives are called data exclusivity. It's different from a patent in that you have exclusive use of your own data, and that you can end up having sort of a monopoly position for a period of time to sell a drug if you have this data exclusivity. Um, it's different from a patent in other companies could develop their own data. You just have exclusive use of your data. So in 2014, we started the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, and that became more of the research arm. So to answer your question, that there's sort of interlocking organizations, MAPS, the nonprofit, and then there was MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. Unfortunately, I was unable to raise all the money that we needed from donors, and we took in investors. And that changed the tenor of everything. And now there's some efforts that are being made. So, since this is a Harvard Connected podcast, let me just say that Antonio Gracias has donated $16 million to Harvard for pan psychedelic collaborations between the divinity school, the law school, the medical school. Other schools can get involved. And so Antonio Gracias is now making a bid to invest in and take over the pharma company and turn it back towards public benefit. So the three main streams that we're doing, but both through the nonprofit and through this pharma company, a public benefit pharma company, which also means that you don't maximize profits, you maximize public benefit. We have three main areas. The first is through science and research, and that's what we're involved in. And some of the things are not going to be, quote, monetizable, like MDMA for conflict resolution or psychedelics in general, to feel your commonality, and then maybe you can negotiate better with people. That's not a moneymaker. MDMA for couples therapy. Couples therapy is not a disorder like that FDA likes to approve for depression, anxiety, things like that. That will be one of the things. So there's research of different kinds, either through the nonprofit or through the public benefit pharma company. Then there's public education, which is what we're doing now. And MAPS is going to be having one of the world's largest psychedelic conferences ever in the 16th to the 20th of June in Denver in 2025. We had Psychedelic Science 2023 in June, also in Denver. We had 12,400 people come. It's just totally shocking. So a lot of public education work as well, and media, all of this, and then advocacy, policy advocacy. So we're also very interested in drug policy reform. So on the one hand, and this is difficult for some people to sort of put them both together, but on the one hand, I think that MDMA should be available and psychedelics should be available as a medicine through the FDA by highly trained therapists administering the drug only under direct supervision and covered by insurance. But then also I think it should be legal, and people should be able to do it as fundamental human right to explore consciousness, and that rather than monitoring what substances are in people's brains or what state of consciousness they're in, we should be regulating behavior. It should be about behavior, so that I think we should move away from drug policy prohibition, which doesn't work, creates terrible incentives, fuels the underground criminal syndicates. It's just not a good idea. And we see here in Massachusetts, with the legalization of cannabis for recreational or also medical use, that the dispensaries are not big sites of crime. There's not gun battles over these dispensaries. We've taken something up from the underground, and it's making tax money. So I think from most people's perspective, the legalization of marijuana in Massachusetts, in California, in Colorado, and all these other states has been a good success. So those are the things. And then the third part is religious use. There's psychedelic churches that are sprouting up all over the place. And there's an incredible book called Immortality Key that is about the origins of Christianity and how psychedelics were involved in the first couple centuries of Christianity. So it's about returning to the roots, the roots of the Western culture we think of as Greece. That's where democracy was created. The Greeks had the Eleusinian mysteries for 2,000 years with a psychedelic. Everybody we know from the history of Greece, Pythagoras, Aristotle, Plato, they all did psychedelics once in their life, at least, in these Eleusinian mysteries. It helped them understand our interconnectedness, and that it informed their politics. And it was most amazing is that the Eleusinian mysteries were available to women and slaves, as well as men. It's just amazing. So it was wiped out by the Catholic Church in 396, something like that. And so I think that what I'm sort of trying to express is that this psychedelic renaissance that we're experiencing now, it's really been over a millennium and a half that psychedelics have been suppressed in Western culture. We're trying to bring it back, and that I think that is at a time of massive crisis. I mean, we're just looking now in the last few days, I'm not sure when you're going to air this, but after the LA fires. And it might not even be after the LA fires. There's new high winds. There might be more LA fires coming. People are really great at denial and repression. So much of this climate change denial, it's now impossible to deny it. We're at a time of crisis. So I think that this kind of emotional and spiritual maturity that we need is responding to this time of crisis. So
Yeah, and what makes psychedelics effective in treating PTSD and other mental health conditions?
well, one of the things that makes psychedelics so effective, and they're different psychedelics. So it's like, think about it, a rainbow. You got all these different colors. So psychedelics are like rainbows. There's all these different colors. So MDMA has particular efficacy, but so does psilocybin, ibogaine, other things for PTSD. But if you have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, your brain is different than normal people's brains. Your brain is different in that you have a hyperactive amygdala, the fear processing part of your brain. So you're always in this state of fear. You have reduction of activity in your prefrontal cortex, means that you're not as logical. You can be triggered. You can hear a sound and you immediately think it's a bomb. It could have been a car backfire, or it could have been a door slam, or whatever, but you don't have a lot of time to process because you're on a hair trigger. You're super fearful and you're not as logical. And also, when you have PTSD, there's a reduction of activity between the amygdala and the hippocampus, where memories are put into long-term storage. So these traumatic memories are as if they're always happening. They're not processed and put in context in the past. At the same time, so what does MDMA do? MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala so that you're able to remember traumatic experiences without that fear response. MDMA increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, so you're able to more logically think about what happened. So this is cognitive restructuring, cognitive processing, and it increases activity between the amygdala and the hippocampus, so you can put things in long-term storage. MDMA also triggers the release of oxytocin, the sort of hormone of love connection. So MDMA is about self-acceptance. It's about compassion and empathy. It's about that, so that when you combine MDMA with therapy, and that's where I want to make an important point, is that people who have PTSD can take MDMA and be worse off. It doesn't automatically make you better. It's the context. If you are supported and feel safe and you can process your different emotions, that's what's really a key part of it. So MDMA connected with therapy can be very helpful for PTSD. Now, the classic psychedelics, the very first work that was ever done with psychedelics for PTSD began in 1961 in the Netherlands at Dr. Bastiaans, and he did LSD therapy for what they called concentration camp syndrome. These were people that had been in the Nazi concentration camps, And they had repressed a lot of these memories. They were terribly traumatized, and he would use LSD as an adjunct to therapy. So LSD doesn't work the same way MDMA does. What LSD does, and one of the ways for people to understand it, is what's called the default mode network, which is sort of our resting state, our ego state. Now, we're bodies. We are birth to death, and the ego is in a way designed to protect us and to um, look out for our individual human existence. And with Abraham Maslow, the hierarchy of needs, he talks about your survival needs are first, and then your belonging needs and self-esteem needs, and then up to self actualization, become your full self. And then in the last few years of his life, Abraham Maslow changed that to self-transcendence. It's becoming beyond yourself to help others, that you become your full self, but you realize you're part of this web of network. So what LSD does is it reduces this default mode network, is sort of our scanning the universe for what's important to us in this ego state, but it reduces activity in the default mode network. So we don't identify as an individual so much. We don't process that. And so we start processing sort of raw information. And then we start feeling like we're part of something much bigger, or that can be. So LSD can both give you this sense of connection to the quantum interconnectedness, but also bring traumas to the surface that you can work with it. So different psychedelics have somewhat different mechanisms of action. But I'd say the main thing is they bring to the surface what we have been suppressing. And I think from a cultural point of view, what I've been saying is we're suppressing the fear about climate change, and the fear, and so people deny it, and so we end up not being able to address the current issues. So I think the different psychedelics work in different ways, but the main thing is that I don't think of them as tools in and of themselves in a safe, supportive therapeutic context.
Mhm. And what are some of the biggest misconceptions about psychedelic therapy, and how do you handle concerns about safety and potential misuse?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that they're a one dose miracle cure. That's what I believed when I was first doing it. Okay, I'm going to be LSD. I'm going to take it one time. I'm going to be, quote, enlightened, whatever that happens to mean. And that these are magic pills, and that they're panaceas. They work for everybody. And that on top of that, um, all you need to do is once. So I think that's totally wrong. It focuses on the experience, but it's also, we've built up decades. There's also multi generational trauma through epigenetic mechanisms that influence our set points for anxiety, depression, things like that. It's not quite clear, and maybe you can tell me from your understanding of quantum and AI, but there's some possibility maybe that the memory, so this epigenetic mechanisms, we don't necessarily think that they transfer memories, just kind of set points for anxiety and depression, but maybe there's some multi-generational transmission of sort of certain kind of memories. I don't know if that's even possible, but the point, I guess, is that this um, process um, takes time. And so, first misconception, one dose miracle cure. Second misconception, it's about the experience, not so much about the integration. The other part of it is that people have this idea that you take LSD and you will go crazy, or it will be so scary. And so I think that can happen, but you need to be supportive. I think those are, and then I also think that there's somewhat of a misconception that um, that psychedelics are the only way. So I think one of the things that's so important that I learned from Stan Grof is that after psychedelics were criminalized, what he did was, many of those people that were involved at the time said, okay, we don't need psychedelics anymore. We're going to meditate. The meditation is the way forward. But what Stan is, he developed what he called holotropic breath work, which was hyperventilation to bring out various experiences that are similar to LSD. And so what he demonstrated from the holotropic breath work is that these are experiences that are in us. And there's different catalysts, and it doesn't even require drugs. You can just do it through breathing, which of course is changing the chemistry of your brain, which is a drug. So I think this idea that there's things that are in the pill is a big misconception. A lot of people are saying, "Oh, I took ayahuasca, and the spirit of ayahuasca told me this." You know, I I think people do experience that. I don't personalize it like that. Like, I think it's coming from my own unconscious and things like that. But I think this idea that there's this that it's the pill or the cactus or the mushroom or whatever it is that is speaking to us, and that there's that. So I think it's really internally, and that's what the holotropic breath work does. I think there's also this misconception um, that when you enter these ego dissolving states, one of the biggest misconceptions is we've used the word ego death, but the ego never dies, and nor should it. We need it. So, but it's finding the proper place. And so I relate this to Copernicus and Galileo. It used to be that everybody thought the Earth is the center of the universe and everything revolves around us. Now we know that that's not the case. Galileo died under house arrest by the Inquisition because this upset the religious views of the day. But we also tend to think our ego makes each of us think we're the center of the universe. And so when you go through this ego dissolution, it feels often to people interpreted as physically dying. We're so identified with our ego, with ourself, that when that's dissolving, people think often that they're dying. Stan Grof tells this incredible story about how he was in like 55 or so in the Czech Republic. He was working with LSD, and they would work with a bunch of people, sit with them as they did LSD before they did it themselves. And then that was part of their education, was to do it themselves. And so he'd seen people feel like they were physically dying, and he would reassure them, you're not really physically dying. It's just your ego. And then he would say, or now he talks about this idea that your ego becomes transparent to the transcendent. So Joseph Campbell talked about this idea that it doesn't go away. We don't want it to. So this idea that as you are dissolving and worried about physical death and your ego surrendering, people experience that either as physical death or as you're going crazy. So I think one of the big misconceptions is that you need to go through that. You need to open up to that. Resisting that is what's the problem. And that when you let go like that, your ego will come back in place, but you will have a deeper understanding of its role. So again, the switch from the earth, from the center of the universe to our being an insignificant little offshoot of the Milky Way. That. So I think that there's a fair amount of misconceptions, and I think that that's the job of therapy, public education, religion, to try to help people that these states are potentially useful, potentially destructive. The other part is that that it's not about the substance, it's about the relationship we have with the substance. And I think that's what is completely missed in the drug policy. Because when you prohibit it, it's like, here's good drugs, here's bad drugs. These bad drugs are illegal, they're the problem. And it's not focusing enough on the relationship, which is the key issue, the attitude. Timothy Leary talked about set and setting. It's about your attitude, the setting, that those matter more than the substance itself. And the last thing I'll say is that it's the culture is more important than the drug experience. And that's what we tend to overgeneralize. So, okay, psychedelics are connected in many, many people's minds with the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the hippies. So you think, okay, psychedelics make you into left-wing radicals, and you're willing to protest the Vietnam War. Well, Antonio Gracias raised money for Trump. A lot of those people that are supporting. So this idea that these substances have these powers, I do believe that when you realize that you're beyond yourself, that we're all interconnected, that will have political positive implications. But what it means to me, though, is the cultural context within which these drugs are taken are more important than the experience itself. And I think people don't really think about it. And for example, some of the people that were involved in one of the ayahuasca churches, União de Vegetal, churches, as a rule, over thousands of years of history, tend to get aligned with the power structure. Instead of speaking on behalf of the marginalized and the poor, they become part of the power structure. So some of the people who'd done ayahuasca were the leaders of União de Vegetal, became supporters of Bolsonaro, who was destroying the Amazon. All right.
So, what excites you the most about recent discoveries in psychedelic research?
Well, what is really Gul Dolan is a neuroscientist from Hopkins. Now she's at UC Berkeley. And what she's talked about is critical periods and neuroplasticity. We haven't really used that word yet, neuroplasticity. That psychedelics open up this period of the brain can rewire itself in a more effective way. So what Gul has talked about is critical periods. We all know that young people, very young people, can grow up learning multiple languages very easily. But as you get older and older, it gets more and more difficult to learn new languages. That there's critical periods for the vision, critical periods for all these different physical properties. And so what psychedelics do, according to Gul, is open up these critical periods of neuroplasticity, of social reward learning. And this links to this idea of the integration process, that there's a period of time after the psychedelic when your brain is more fluid and you can rewire and route around the patterns that produce fear, depression, anxiety. And the longer you're in the psychedelic state, the longer these periods of neuroplasticity or these critical periods last. So Gul has this chart where she talks about the critical periods after LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, ibogaine. And ibogaine lasts the longest. And so for weeks and weeks, months or two after ibogaine, you're able to do this integration work in a more successful way because your brain is more capable of rewiring itself. So I think Gul's studies are one of the most important new discoveries in psychedelics about this idea of critical periods and the opening of these critical periods. And what it again points to is it's not about the experience. Houston Smith, who's an expert in world religions, said there's a difference between a religious experience and a religious life. And so what we're seeing, there's a difference between a breakthrough under psychedelics and changing your baseline. And so I think this has been something that provides the physiological underpinning explanations for mechanism of action of how it is that the integration periods can be so incredibly successful. One of the other new innovations that sort of developed that's not happened yet from research, but more comes from underground, but is sort of bubbling up into research is this different ways people are combining different psychedelics. So again, what Stan Grof has said is that the future of psychiatry, he thinks, is going to be people taking MDMA and then an hour later doing 5-MeO DMT through these vape pens. So people have heard about that maybe as the Sonoran Desert Toad. It's a toxin from this toad. It used to be that the only way you used it was you would smoke it. And it was this overwhelming blast, dissolving your sense of self into this. I felt like I was sort of at the center of the sun, when I took it. And people feel, that kind of stuff. But when you do MDMA, it reduces your fear. And then when you use the vape pens and do smaller amounts, small, medium, and large, you can sort of watch peacefully as your ego dissolves. And I said earlier, people tend to confuse that with physical death. So there is a fear of letting go of our orientation that we'll go crazy, we'll never come back. So this MDMA space of safety, self-love, self-acceptance, and then this ego dissolving from the vape pens from 5-MeO is a real new development. And it will soon, eventually, I think, bubble up into being researched. Right now, there is research with 5-MeO, there is research with MDMA, but never together. So I think those are some of the main new discoveries that I'm very excited about.
And how do you think psychedelics influence our understanding of consciousness and interconnectedness?
Well, Justin Rosenstein is someone who has developed the like button. His team developed the like button for Facebook. And he's very interested in sort of this idea of other ways of knowing beyond our five senses. So one of the areas of research that was going on during the 60s, 70s. So we've come back with neuroscience research, with psychotherapy research, with creativity research a bit. But what has not happened is ESP, extrasensory perception. So with Justin and I had this conversation about how um, maybe there are this whole question of like telepathy. Can we perceive information in other ways than the known five senses? And if we really are interconnected in this way, or through holographic kind of mechanisms, or is there some way we can get it? And I'm reminded where I was saying to Justin, why are you interested in this? And he said, well, maybe there's a way to discover a whole new internet. So, I mean, there's so much that's in the way of that, so I don't, and I'm saying that I've had only one experience in my whole life that makes me think, I don't know how I got that information other than some transmission. It was when I was in an MDMA state, and this woman who'd been an ex-lover was in a dream state, and we had these sort of experiences, even though we were disconnected by distance, hadn't spoken to each other for over a year, but it was kind of unusual. So it could be coincidence. It could certainly be coincidence. And of course, we're always looking for meaning, and we make meaning out of coincidences and stuff. But I think that there's this potential over maybe the next decades as we learn more about quantum and learn more about how we are interconnected. Is there some way? Jung called it the collective unconscious. Is there some way to access that? But I think this other part is that there's been an incredible study that I believe I've heard is going to be published sometime soon, done at Johns Hopkins and done at NYU, New York University, about giving religious leaders psilocybin, religious leaders from different traditions. And yeah, it's a tremendous, and people at Divinity School here know all about it. Um, and in fact, Hunt Priest, his real name is, started the Ligari Institute about Christianity and psychedelics. MAPS was his fiscal sponsor. He was a subject in this study. So, is there a common mystical core between all religions? So, basically, this idea is, and when we talk about interconnectedness, can you think of religions like languages? Like English is not better than German, is not better than Russian. They're different ways. Each language has its own cultural flair, its own cultural context, but they're all coming from this core of how do we use our vocal cords? How do we communicate to each other meaning? And we do that through language, but there's multiple different languages. Nobody says, I'm going to kill you because you speak Russian and I speak English. Now, religions, people will kill each other because you've got a different religion than me. So, is there this potential over time to discover, is there really a common mystical core beneath all the different religions? And then the religions develop in order to experience and express that in their own different, unique ways. So I think there was a book by the Assistant Secretary General of the United States Nations, Robert Mueller, called New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality. He wrote it in 83. And it was this thesis that we have the United Nations to try to mediate conflicts between countries. Doesn't work all that well, as we can see. But that he felt that a lot of the conflicts are not based on nationalism, but based on religion. And can we help the fundamentalists of all the religions who are killing each other over minor disputes, but really about power? Are they really able? Are we able to have kind of this global spirituality? And the cover of the book was a picture of the Earth from space. So I think, how can we really understand? Now, we've got global warming, we've got nuclear weapons, we've got a lot of problems that are global. And I think that we're going to need to come up with global solutions, and we're going to need to have global kind of partnerships. U.S. could eliminate all of our carbon emissions, and if the rest of the world is not changing, it's not going to do anything because it's a global system. So I think this interconnectedness, we need to move away from, selfishness towards global thinking. And I think psychedelics, used well in ways where cultural support can help people experience this interconnectedness and can lead to better kind of decision making on a global scale. That's the hope. Otherwise, we're like lemmings going off a cliff.
And can you maybe describe what one typical psychedelic experience looks like from your perspective?
No. Well, what I'm saying is there's not a typical. That's what I'm trying to say. It depends on who is it, what's their background, which psychedelic. But I'll give you one um, remarkable one. This was one of the most amazing experiences. Well, here so this is just a personal experience. I was doing MDMA by myself. I was camped out on the Pacific Ocean on the beach, mountain right behind me, and I'm taking MDMA at night. And this is 1985, and I'm thinking about Brother David Steindl-Rast, who is a monk who had tried MDMA and felt it could deepen his meditation. And he already knew, though, at what had taken me so long to learn is that you don't need to keep doing MDMA. You do it once, you're meditating, and then you can learn how to get back to that without the MDMA in the integration process. But anyway, I was spending the night, and I was at one point I felt like I would just dissolve into the universe. I was right on the Pacific Ocean, enormous. The stars were incredible. It was in Big Sur, and I thought, well, I'm just part of this bigger thing, and why am I still here? I realized after this universe, I was still here, and I felt like that it was gravity. That gravity was the reason that I didn't fly off into everywhere, but that gravity was a force of love. It was connection. And so I felt this image of I'm cradled in the arms of gravity, as warm as if it was a lover. And that love was interwoven into the universe, this force of attraction. And that made it so that that was the most mystical experience of my life. That I felt that here it was. And ever since then, I was not in a relationship at the time. I was, but I never felt as lonely afterwards because I could sort of tap into this universal love. And I also felt that there was this kind of how should I just put it? That this was available to all of us everywhere. It was just right. So then it took me about 30 years since then that I was at dinner with Brother David Steindl-Rast, and I was saying, I had the most mystical experience of my life. I was thinking about you also, and I told him the story about being cradled in the arms of gravity, and what did he think about this? And he was silent for a while. And then he looked at me and he said, I think about gravity every day. Yeah. Now, that's one experience. I'll just give you another quick one, which was that this was I mentioned this in my TED Talk, but this is a real good way of how MDMA works. And I wouldn't say it's typical, it's unusual. This is a guy who got cured from MDMA, with MDMA therapy, cured from PTSD in one session. It doesn't often happen that way. But what happened was that he was under the influence of MDMA, and he had this realization that there was something beneficial from his PTSD. He was disabled. He could not work. He was suffering for years. Nothing helped him. MDMA. So under his first MDMA experience, he's realizing that he's getting benefits from having PTSD. The benefit is that he's showing his loyalty to the friends who died. He's suffering, and that keeps in mind the people that had died, that his fellow warriors who'd been killed. And so once he realized that this was about honor, it was about honoring the memory of his dead friends, then he was able to switch and see himself from the eyes of his dead friends. So this perspective shift happened, and his dead friends were basically looking at him saying, we're dead. We cannot enjoy life. You can honor us in a different way. You're not really honoring us by being constantly disabled. You can honor us by living. We can live through you. You should live the best that you can. That's a different way to honor our memory. Life is so precious. We don't have it. And so he said to himself, okay, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And in that moment, he cured himself of PTSD. Then he said, I'm taking opiates for pain, but I really think I'm taking opiates for escape. I don't really need it for pain. I'm going to stop the opiates. And then he said, I don't really need this MDMA anymore either. I'm done. He was in a study where he would get MDMA 3 times, once a month for 3 times, with 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions for preparation and integration. He said, I'm dropping out of the study. And the therapist said, you can drop out anytime you want, but would you be willing to do the long-term follow-up at 2 months and 1 year? And he did that. 2 months, no PTSD. 1 year, he's thinking, it's getting near the 1 year anniversary. He's thinking, maybe I could benefit from another MDMA experience. And the therapist said, look, you've dropped out. You can't really come back in, but at least let's do this test and see if you even have PTSD. 12 months, no PTSD. That was over 15 years ago. He's doing great. So it's that perspective shift, that seeing things from a different way, that you can then make tremendous progress.
So, what advice would you give to someone considering psychedelic experience?
Well, it's about preparation. The experience itself, again, MDMA is a tool, and it can be used well, it can be used poorly. So it's very important to look at this. Now, you said considering a psychedelic experience. If you consider like, oh, I want to take this and go to a party, that's a psychedelic experience. But I think the first thing is you need to be ready for whatever comes up. It could be painful. It could be beautiful. It could be your worst fears. It could be a traumatic memory that you hadn't thought of for a long time. It could be bliss. But you have to be open for whatever comes. That's the fundamental essence of our inner-directed therapy. Our therapeutic approach is we support what's emerging. And things can emerge either in body pains or body sensations or in memories or in emotions without a story or any different way, that you need to be open to whatever is coming and experience that. You need to be in a safe place, because you may scream, you might cry, you don't want to have to pay attention. That's why it's good to have somebody there who's not doing the psychedelics, that they are your buffer between the inner world where you're focusing more and more. And then you also need to think about it as something that you give yourself the time to do the integration. So I would say to people that you don't, anything you can get from psychedelics, you can get other ways, but that psychedelics are more reliable, often they're more powerful, and that you just need to approach them with respect. There was a flyer, a 2-page flyer that Sasha Shulgin and Ann Shulgin, Sasha, who sort of rediscovered MDMA, that he would hand out back in the 70s and 80s, late 70s and the 80s, with people who were trying MDMA. The last line of it was, there's no such thing as a casual experiment. I think that's really important for people to realize, is you have to take it seriously. You don't know where it's going to go. The other part is you do all of this preparation and you think, oh, okay, I've got PTSD and this is my trauma and this is what I'm going to work on. And you do all of this preparation. But then what you need to do is just throw it all away and come up with whatever emerges. And your unconscious will be the guide, and it will take you, who knows, maybe different places, circuitous, whatever.
Mhm. And how can listeners support the work of MAPS and the psychedelic movement in general?
MAPS is a nonprofit, so you can support us by becoming a member of MAPS, maps.org. The other thing we'd encourage is, if people are curious about the field, the Psychedelic Science Conference is coming up in June, in December. We had, as I said, 12,400 people before. This year, we've had over 1,500 submissions for papers to present. It's just astonishing. It used to be that every psychedelic conference that was happening, I would know everything that was being presented because there wasn't that much, and we would pick and choose. Now, it's like so much that I haven't even heard of has been started, and yet it's now done and they're ready to publish the results. So I think people can come to the psychedelic conference. They can donate to MAPS. They can, I think, learn as much as you can, both from knowledge and your own experiences. And the other part is what people can do that doesn't cost any money at all, if they happen to have had psychedelic experiences, whether useful or not, it's to talk to people about it. So one of the things we look at, gay marriage and gay rights. How did that happen? Well, the big coming out. People who are gay are hidden, and you don't necessarily know that they're gay, and then you have these people that you respect for one reason or another, and then they say they're gay, and then you think, hey, maybe they're not so bad, or maybe they're good, or maybe it's just, so we need people to tell their stories. So what we like to say is that the FDA needs data, but people need stories. And so if you've got stories to tell, particularly to people who you think might not be pro psychedelic, but are confused. Speak to them, and particularly members in your own family if you can. So that doesn't cost any money, but it could be risking reputational risk. But people need to just step up and tell their stories. That's a great way.
And the final question: if you could achieve one breakthrough in your lifetime, what would it be?
Well, it's happening right this minute, which is the breakthrough is I'm trying to get our pharma company back to thinking about public benefit and not thinking about it as an investment for traditional pharma. I think that the breakthrough is to really develop a well funded public benefit psychedelic pharmaceutical company that could potentially be a model for the whole pharma industry. But, and that's what we're trying to do with supporters who are now using some of their resources, not for making money, but for public good. That's the breakthrough that I had hoped to accomplish, that I failed to accomplish because I couldn't raise all the money from donors and had to take in investors. That changed everything, and now we're trying to change that back. So that is the breakthrough. The other breakthrough, there could be multiple different breakthroughs, I think, but the other breakthrough is really to eventually, get MDMA approved by the FDA. That's what I've been working on basically for my the 38 and a half plus years of MAPS. That was something that we thought was going to happen in August, or hoped, and it wasn't. So the real big breakthrough that would make me, super happy, die peacefully, all of that would be FDA approval of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD as the first psychedelic-assisted therapy. We have ketamine. Ketamine is approved as a medicine, but it's approved without therapy. And so it's approved in a pharmaceutical model. What that means is that without the integration, the results fade over time. And so what do? You need to buy more ketamine. That's what the pharma company wants you to do. They don't make any money on therapy. They make money on it. But when you combine ketamine with therapy, the results last longer. You don't need as much ketamine. So there is one example of a psychedelic, lower doses of ketamine, even though it's a dissociative anesthetic, and lower doses of psychedelic. But yeah, the breakthrough would be psychedelic-assisted therapy approved by FDA.
Dr. Doblin, I would like to thank you for your time and for this truly wonderful and very interesting conversation.
Yes, it's been a pleasure. I look forward to more, and I look forward to learning more about what you're going to discover with quantum and AI and medical discoveries, things like that.